for Zoom for,
I know, as long as I've been using it, I still can't find things.
we've only been doing this for the entire pandemic. And awesome. So let me see if I can go into, let's see. Let me play from the start and wait for the spinning wheel of doom. Let's see. Oh, good. I can still see folks. Can everyone see and hear me all right? Great. So today I'm going to be doing just about a 50-minute presentation on writing chapter length literature reviews, because this is the qualifying prep weekend. So at this point, you are gathering your materials together, not just studying for qualifying exams, whether that shows up as written exams or oral exams, but you're also looking forward toward writing your dissertation. And there's a lot in common for writing a literature review for a dissertation and just a literature review for a regular paper, but there are some considerations in terms of organization where it becomes that much more important for us to really focus on, am I telling a coherent narrative? Am I really organizing my sources in a way that future me will not be incredibly overwhelmed by? So hopefully that will all become clearer by the end of this, and you'll have some tools in your toolbox. So let's see. Oh, it's doing that thing where it forces me to go next using the little button instead of my keyboard. I love technology. All right, so what is the purpose of a literature review? Our first gut instinct is to say, well, it's to tell you what literature is out there, but it's a little bit more than that. So the basic purpose of a literature review is to give a sense of what has been said before, but specifically in a way that builds up to your argument. And the literature review in the dissertation process, in your qualifying exams, it serves to build up the logic behind your specific research question and research approach in such a way that your narrative should make it clear that what you are proposing is the only logical next step, right? We're trying to trick them into thinking and knowing that we are on the right track. You're out imposter syndrome, guys. It's going to be okay. So specifically, we use literature reviews to form a critical analysis of the works that we think are most relevant and significant. These 2 points are important because you're not reviewing everything that's out there. One, not everything that's out there is worth reviewing. And two, not all of it builds up towards your argument. Now, I'm not telling you ignore things that, disagree or bring up challenges. I'm saying treat this in a way where you're being selective. This is also a sanity saving measure. You don't have to read everything out there. You don't have to review everything out there. Don't try and think that this has to be exhaustive. Now, the other purpose here is to bring your readers up to date on what the current state of the research is. So you're saying, okay, maybe the most famous thing on this was written in 1970, but we have 50 years of research after that. And so you want your reader to understand what has happened in that time frame and why are the studies or approaches you're proposing a logical extension of that. You're also providing context, right? You are essentially giving a TLDR for whoever is reading your dissertation for your committee. We often like to think that our professors, our advisors, our committees, they are so intelligent. They know more than we will ever know. They are the experts in their field. But at the point that you all have gotten to, you're actually the expert in your field. And they have not read everything that you have read. And so the literature review at this point also serves as a way to introduce them to maybe parts of the field, parts of your area of study that they're not as familiar with, and to give them the context that they need to understand the rest of your program of research. So again, the lit review also allows you to identify research strategies, to justify the instruments you're using for data collection, to provide a logical basis for the procedures you're proposing. Like I said earlier, you're justifying your choices using existent literature. And it also puts it into context of what else is out there. This is the general understanding of what we're familiar with a literature review. But what's interesting also is that I get a lot of questions in the Writing Center, people going, well, how do I build up credibility? how do I help them understand that I do know what I'm talking about? And that's where the literature review comes in as well, is this is your chance to say, you've done your homework. You've gone through what's out there. You have made sure that no one is doing exactly what you're doing and made sure that what you are planning to do in the rest of your dissertation makes sense. I like to use this specific visualization put together by Jessica Delgado, who is another one of our consultants in the Writing Center. I find it very helpful as just mapping out this process that we're going through with the literature review. And as you know, you're selecting a topic, and that helps you specify and frame. You search through the literature. We're going to talk about some ways of exploring and cataloging literature. You're developing your argument, because remember, a literature review is not just a list of facts. This is not a laundry list. This is not a shopping list. This is not a, just a bunch of, this is not just a bunch of citations in a row. This is a narrative argument that you are forming using the literature that's out there. And then there's the surveying, critiquing, and then writing the literature review itself. And often we go through this a couple times. You're going to go through, as you go through the process of writing your literature review, you are going to be refining your topic, refining your research question, finding new articles, letting some go. So this is why it's a circle, not a list. And another way of looking at the role of the literature review is through this model that we use quite a bit in the Writing Center. I'm not going to go into the CARS model, the creating a research space model, in too much depth, just because, and this is a plug for the CWR Canvas page, we have a lot of great resources that you can look through in your own time, and some forms and models that you can use to organize your writing. But the purpose of the CARS model for the literature review is to help you figure out and establish that significance of this broader topic that you're working with, discuss what's already been done with the topic, identify the gap, identify this niche that you're filling with new research ideas, and talk about, what could be done differently. And then also saying, okay, what are you doing about this gap? Why is what you are proposing filling this gap in the literature? Also gives you a chance to think about, why hasn't that gap been filled before? Sometimes it's good to interrogate the purpose of what we're doing and our approach. And I often, when that happens, either talk to my advisor, or another plug for the librarians, because when you are in this brainstorming section, yes, the Writing Center can help, but I cannot speak highly enough of the subject matter librarians in the Honnold Mudd Library. Go on their website, check out who the subject matter librarian is for your specific field, bring them some of the articles that you're working with, and just sit down and get their help as you work through that initial brainstorming process, and also in the literature search in general. All right, but going back to the purpose of the literature review. Like I said, plays an essential role in establishing what's been done, and we also want to assert what is missing. But this is also your chance to establish the credibility of your entire research project as a whole. No pressure. And because this credibility is improved by a good literature review, then laying the foundation of your dissertation through a thoughtful, critically done, well-organized literature review. Everything else just flows from it. So I'm a huge proponent of, be a little bit intense about this part of the process, because the rest becomes so much easier after that. So narrowing your topic. You all are here for the Corals Weekend. Many of you have narrowed your topic at least down to a general sense of, here's what I think I'm doing. And here is the general topic. But with the literature review, it can be really easy to fall off into tangents or get distracted by subtopics. And so I find that starting your literature review brainstorming process with this sort of decision tree. So asking yourself first, what are my subtopics? What are some of the different directions that I could be pulled to from my primary topic? and which of them are actually interesting, which are compelling, which do I want to point myself towards, and which will sort of act as canaries in the coal mine. So if I start, reading too much off into one subtopic that isn't really relevant to the story that I want to tell in my literature review, that's a sign for me to stop and course correct. It's also a good point to ask, who's your audience, right? So in this point, your audience is your committee for the most part. So get to know what your committee wants from you. Get to know them as people, get to know their writing style, look at what they've published, look at where they've published. Is your committee full of people who want every single nitty-gritty detail about something? Or is your committee full of people who maybe want a more general beginning that's less detailed and then refining down to a more detailed conclusion? And it seems like a lot, but just sitting down with your committee members, asking for a meeting and saying, what are you looking for in this part of my dissertation, can save you a lot of pain in later stages. And also, what does the assignment require? The Center for Writing and Rhetoric can help you quite a bit when it comes to looking at structure, looking at the general quality of writing and clarity of your argument. But we can't tell you department specific stuff. We can't tell you exactly what your advisors, what your department requires in this literature review aspect of your dissertation. So that's something that's really good to look into, so that then when you come back, we can give you a little bit more useful help. I also say, and I'll talk about this more as I go through the rest of the talk, looking at reference sources. So figuring out where are you going to get your references from, who are the major authors or the primary works that you want to use as a focal point for the rest of your search. And I'll also give a shout out to a website called Connected Papers. And Connected Papers uses a node modeling network, essentially, to you can put in a topic, you can put in a core article or book, and from there it will look at who is in conversation with that article or book. And it's a really nice way of getting a sense of where is the field going and who is cited most in what subtopics. So Connected Papers is really good for this general reference and reference sources part of this narrowing down of the topic. All right, now a topic is not a research question, right? You have a topic for your dissertation, or maybe you're working on one. But a lot of the biggest issues that I see when someone comes in to work on a literature review is they have a topic, but it's broad, it's vague, it's an all about paper. And it leads them into this laundry list literature review problem where it's a list of summaries of articles and books without a coherent narrative. Now, from your topic, you want to narrow down that research question. And this research question, it's more narrow and specific. You cannot just summarize it in 2 to 3 words. And it's usually phrased in the form of a question. And I often recommend phrasing it in terms of a question that doesn't have a yes or no answer. Because you don't want the end result of your lit review and your dissertation to just be yes or no. You want it to be yes, because, and here's why that's important. And so setting up your research question well will assist with that. Now, a good research question for a literature review also identifies a specific perspective on a topic, a specific approach. This will help you when searching for articles, when organizing articles. It also makes just the general organization less painful. You're also looking for a relationship between your key terms. You have some keywords, you have some general sub-questions that are in conversation with each other, and your research question will help you figure out how are the different parts of my paper talking to each other. It helps to anthropomorphize, I promise. You won't seem too out there. All right, let's talk about structure, because this is the part where, and I speak for myself, we all tend to flounder a little bit. So different types of literature reviews have different structures. So one of the best things that you can do is say, okay, Am I writing a narrative? Am I doing a systematic literature review? Am I doing a focused literature review? Am I doing a meta-analysis? Each of these types of literature reviews has a different way that you search for articles, a different approach to organization, and different kinds of questions that you're looking to answer. Most of you, for your dissertation and for prepping for quals, will be doing either a narrative or a systematic literature review, depending on your field. Most of us end up doing a narrative literature review, and luckily, it's one of the less painful approaches, and much less painful than a meta-analysis. And when we do a narrative literature review, we select a certain number of previous articles or books on a topic, and we use it to set up the need for additional research. Now, a systematic literature review is the other common one. This has a strict methodology for source selection, and you would often use tables to represent the research in context of that selection criteria. Now, again, most of you will be doing the narrative literature review, but double check with your department to see if they require a systematic. I know some of the bio folks get stuck in that approach. I won't go into the focused or meta-analysis literature reviews just because it's not as relevant for us today, but feel free to ask me any follow-up questions about those. Now, if your lit review is more than a few pages, as all of yours will be, you have these three parts, right? You have an introduction, you have your thematic organization, so the middle, and then you have a conclusion. Don't discount the importance of the introduction. And for this, I say go back to the axis model, that assertion, evidence, explaining the evidence, explain significance, structure for paragraph structure, because the introduction of your literature review justifies why you're doing the literature review in general. It helps to set up the narrative. It helps to explain where are we getting to, where are we hoping to get to in the conclusion. And also, it is the point at which your reader will be the most engaged. By the time, no matter how much they like you, no matter how dedicated they are, by the time your committee member gets to the end of your literature review, they're not paying as close attention. And so in the introduction, you are guiding them to understand what is most important, what should I pay attention to while reading the rest of this paper. I'll talk more about the thematic organization as we go through, but it's just that the key parts of the literature should be chosen and discussed with the purpose of looking towards clarifying your research question in the project. And your conclusion, again, you're restating the key elements. For the conclusion, my recommendation for the conclusion is I don't have a formula for it. I say, go look at the literature review of someone you trust in your department who has worked with your advisor. Because the way that a conclusion is written varies so much depending on the needs of the specific program. Some want you to set up specifically your research project. Some don't want to hear anything about your project in the conclusion and want to save that for the next chapter. So rather than potentially lead you astray, I'm going to cop out and say, check with your advisor and your peers. All right, again, I will keep saying this until I turn blue in the face. A literature review is not a list. It's not a list of summaries. It's not a laundry list. I don't want to hear what everyone else did with nothing in there about what you did. This is about you. You are the star of the show. This is all justifying why you are doing what you're doing. And if there's nothing about your own narrative, your own purpose in there, it also just becomes very dry and we get lost. We don't know where we're going or why we're reading it. And that's not a place you want your reader to be. Also think about how you're deciding the appropriateness of the themes. What are the subsections of this literature review? How are you deciding, why am I focusing on this aspect of the material and not this aspect? Why am I looking at this parts of the past research field and not these parts? And anytime that you're saying, I'm including this, I'm including this because, or some scholars have also looked at it in this way. We are not going to be focusing on this because. So make these very systematic choices. And once you've established the themes that you're going to be covering in your literature review, use a heading system. Be kind to yourself. Even if you are working in, if you're not working with APA style, I like the current APA style headings just for outlining, because I find them very clear in terms of helping to map out that progress. So you also want, oh, I'm gonna move, there we go. You also want in this middle section, this body of your literature review, you wanna make sure that when you're organizing your themes and sub-themes, it's okay to take a few paragraphs and just put that to one source that is really foundational. It's okay if you don't spend the same amount of time on every single article. Some articles are meant for one citation at the end of a sentence, and some articles are going to really help build into the next part of your literature review. But the one thing I will say there is, if you're citing more than 3, really more than 2 articles or sources in one sentence, it's time to break it up. You want to think, who is the most important person to cite for this point? And are there other things that I need to talk about with these other articles? We often forget that the purpose of the citation is to direct the reader to a source that backs up what we're saying. And if I have 3 sources in one sentence, they're not going to know which source actually covers the core aspect of that sentence. I'm also a huge proponent of outline, or else because if I don't outline, I get lost and things get very sad, and then my advisor's angry and it wastes time. So I big up proponent of outlining. And in it, the other thing to think about is that when you're outlining, each of those major sections may have its own introduction. And so when you write your core introduction, think about, for your sub-themes, for your subsections, how do you need to introduce those sub-themes and subsections in order for it to make sense in the context of the larger core purpose and narrative? And also make sure that your reader finishes, when they're done reading, that they know what is and isn't known. If you just put a whole bunch of summaries of articles out there without saying, hey, this creates this gap, or hey, we already know everything about this, so I'm not going to go talk about it more, they might be a little lost. All right, let's talk about outlining. So as we move from the large themes to these sub-themes nestled inside, you want to make sure that that progression makes sense. You want to make sure in your outline that your headers make sense as moving from larger and more general topics into these smaller, more specific subtopics and sub-themes. And it also helps with outlining. I like to stick the citations in there, but also notes about what is this citation doing for the progression of the narrative, but also what is it doing to justify my purpose in writing this literature review. And it's a good time to check to make sure that you're not repeating yourself a lot, because repetition is very common in these longer literature reviews as a Achilles heel that makes it feel like your argument is going in circles. So anytime that you're like, oh, I think I've already talked about this, ask yourself, look at your outline and ask yourself, where is the most logical place to actually introduce this point? Here's a good example of a number heading system. I like a number heading system myself. I have people in my lab who swear by a number and letter mix. It doesn't matter as long as it makes sense to you. The only person who needs to understand your outline right now is you. But you can see here we have an introduction point, we have main headings, and this example specifically says first theme, second theme, sub-theme. Find a way that works for you, but also make sure that you have a note into, when I call something this, what does it mean? Because future you who's tired and writing at 1 a.m. won't understand. Here's another example. This looks a little bit more similar to the way that I do my outlines. I'm a big fan also of combining an outline with aspects of an annotated bibliography that I'll talk about briefly in a second, because I find that if I just have this thing, then this thing, then this thing, without explanation underneath of, like sometimes I'll put in a topic sentence, sometimes I'll put in a specific quote that helps me understand what do I want to cover here. Sometimes I will make notes about the relationship between the citations I want to bring up, and having that within your outline can be really helpful to help yourself stay on track, but it's also a good brainstorming method. And many people say, okay, I'm just going to outline at the very beginning of my process and then never come back to it once you start writing. But think of your outline as a living document, because as you're writing the literature review itself, you may get confused. You may say, okay, maybe I don't think this is as effective a progression as I thought it was. So you go back to your outline and say, how can I adjust the order of this narrative to make the most sense, to be as effective as possible? And I also like this, and there'll be a recording of this, but I'll also see if we can share this PowerPoint, because I do like this layout for the conclusion here of some questions that you can ask yourself while writing the conclusion to help frame that specific transition between the end of your lit review and the beginning of what will probably be your methodology paragraph, or sorry, chapter. So, analysis strategies. When we are synthesizing, if I can speak, and critiquing literature, we often start by saying, okay, how are things different? How are things similar? And what is the contrast between different sources, different approaches, different themes and sub-themes? And when we're doing that, we will critique articles, and it's not just saying this was bad, this was good. It's saying, okay, this article tells me up to this point, but there's a gap here. And what is the gap? Are there inconsistencies between what is written about your topic? And why are there inconsistencies? Is it that there were two different methodological approaches? Was it that something came up during the 70s and again in the 90s, but it was for slightly different reasons and treated slightly differently? Are there debates that continue and change in your field? For example, I study memory. People have been arguing about false memories for like 50 years, but the definition changed halfway through the debate. And so the literature changed. And you have to understand what's going on in the literature to be able to critique those progressions. And as you're reading, ask yourself, what's the main argument of this paper? Has the author sufficiently looked at other explanations? Is the methodology appropriate? Sometimes you find an article that looks really promising, and then you're like, that was a sample size of 6 done in one population that cannot be generalized. The variance is high and they should feel sad. Was it funded by someone you do not trust? Are the findings presented in such a way where the logic is sufficient to address your specific research objectives? Think about, does this evidence support your conclusion, your main argument? Has it helped advance knowledge in your field? Has it been ignored? Should it have been ignored or not? But also, how is the article in conversation to others in the field? And so this is again where I like to keep an annotated bibliography, and also using that connected papers tool to see what is the relationship and conversation between the sources I'm using. Now, again, I'll say it, literature reviews have an argument. You are not an objective observer with no motivation here who is just giving me a summary of what's happened in the past. You want to establish what's been done, what needs to be done, and why what you are proposing to do is the right approach to meet the need of your field, to meet the need of this discussion. And also think about the fact that your argument is your version of the story of this research question. And we're not magical beings who summon brilliant ideas out of the ether. We are in conversation with all the articles that have come before. We're in a conversation with everything we've read. We are pushing the field forward. And so I think here it's saying, think about how you are in conversation with those scholars. And, you know, that when someone's like, oh, do I really need to cite this? The answer is usually yes, because it didn't pop out of your head with no background. Sorry, I'm again removing a wayward cat. Okay, so thinking more about your argument and developing the argument, and moving the cat again. Your argument can be a working argument. When you do the first draft of your literature review, it doesn't have to be the end all be all solid set in stone. Your question might change slightly. Your approach to addressing that question might change slightly. That's okay. And you're going to learn more as you read through the sources. You might read something where you're like, oh no, this is really close to what I think I'm doing. So ask yourself, how is it different? How does it actually move your narrative forward? And you want your working argument to guide your readings, but keep an open mind. You know, you never know what you're going to find during the literature search process. And so that brings us to the literature search process of how do you keep everything straight? This is something I am still working on personally. I think this is, again, it's an iterative process. There's no right or wrong way to do anything. And one way of keeping yourself sane is with a source matrix. So you can use a spreadsheet or a synthesis matrix. I know that the Writing Center has a couple templates you can download. This will allow you to organize or reorganize sources pretty easily. It gives you a snapshot of what you have so far, helps you consolidate your notes, and you can also include the information that's useful to you while excluding some of the information that makes you feel overwhelmed. And we typically use a source matrix at the collection and drafting stages of literature review, but I find it really useful all the way through. Sometimes when I have my sub-themes, I'll reorganize my source matrix spreadsheet to tell me, okay, what articles am I using for what sub-theme? And that also helps organizing my other notes. You can list sources on one side of the table, key themes on the other. You know, they go into a lot of suggestions about how best to do this, but I say follow your heart and choose what is most helpful and least overwhelming. So here's some examples. I love this one because it's about anxiety in graduate students, and I think we can all relate. And in here, you have the short version of the citation on the left, and you have notes about different topics that are useful to this. Now, if you don't want to go by sub-themes, you can also have across the top, you can also have your sub-themes in the column. That's how I like to do it personally, because that way I can then sort based on sub-theme, and you can get really nerdy about merging cells in Excel and probably other things that you should not be as excited about as I am. And you can also organize based on author. Sometimes an author is very prolific in your field, and you want to make sure that you are catching everything that they've written, so you can organize it that way. This is another example that one of my old colleagues found very helpful, but gives me anxiety. So I say, if this works for you, go for it. They have it done by year, title, last name, and source type, with a little bit more of like keywords off to the right. So it's less about organizing themes and more about just organizing what sources do they have so far. So it's a slightly different purpose. There also are programs that you can use. You can download. Mendeley, Zotero can function as the source matrix. So there's no wrong way to do this. But as you're going through your literature search, these are some questions that I find helpful. So what's my specific research question? Am I looking for issues about methodology, theory, policy? When you're organizing your source matrix, you know, if there might be some articles that specifically are speaking to your choice of methods, your choice of theory, your choice of other sub-themes. So you can use this question to help you organize those articles. And also, does the research article even match my research question? Because sometimes you start reading the abstract and you're like, this title was deeply misleading, as were the keywords. and don't waste your time on it. Your time is very valuable. If something doesn't fit, toss it out. But also, am I looking in the right places? And this is where I'll circle back to giving the plug for the subject librarians, because sometimes we are looking in the wrong places. Sometimes there are journals that we haven't even thought about. Sometimes we're looking just at books, and we might also want to look at scholarly articles. Sometimes we're looking at peer-reviewed articles and completely forget that law journals exist, and then getting help to figure out, okay, I can look in a law journal for this. There are the most incredible legal briefs that you would never find through just a traditional like JSTOR search. But also, will your reader find your review useful? Why or why not? Is your review actually doing what you're hoping to do? Or have we gone off into left field? And are the articles that you're pulling working towards that, supporting that narrative argument? And also, one of the hardest bits is, have I included or accounting for people who don't agree with me? Sometimes we're so desperate to be like, please just let me defend, please just let me write my dissertation. And it can be very tempting to engage in those questionable research practices of saying, well, this found something different. We still have to account for that. Be a good, honest scholar. And another method that I like to use when I am reading through these articles that I pulled and deciding how will they fit into my literature review is this SCAN method with 2 A's. So the first is source type. Does this source help you answer your research question? What kind of source is it? Does it meet the requirements for the assignment? Because sometimes there are types of sources that you don't want to include. Some places will completely let you use a popular news article and cite it, and some places want absolutely nothing to do with anything that is not a peer-reviewed article. So how current is your source? Is that next question. When was it published? There can be a whole bunch of really great supporting articles, but if they're from the 80s or 90s, and then everything that's been published more recently disagrees with part of what you're proposing, we can't just forget the last 30 years of research. We have to still account for it. And also, I always find it's also a bit of a red flag for me if the only things that I'm finding relevant to a certain topic were published 20 years ago. So why was a certain strain of research abandoned? That's something you have to address. Authority. Is the author or writer credible? You know, what in psych, occasionally we'll run into a Jordan Peterson problem where someone who used to write semi-credible articles is now a complete crackpot, and you cannot in any way justify including their research, and that's sad. But make sure that the person is actually somebody that you would like to have your name next to. Also, reputable publishers. This is really important, making sure that it is not a for-profit predatory journal who will publish absolutely anything regardless of the quality as long as the author pays them. So make sure to be mindful of that. Also, accuracy. Is it peer-reviewed? Are there things you know is wrong? Are the conclusions generally agreed upon by other experts in the field? So just do your due diligence. But also neutrality. Look for obvious bias or prejudice. You wouldn't cite an article about the health of sugar that was funded by a big sugar company, right? So it's the same way that you probably wouldn't want to cite certain think tanks on certain political issues. So again, just being mindful, but also saying, okay, am I also seeing themes when answering these questions? Now you've done this, you have found all your sources, you're trying to figure out how can I read through this and organize my notes in a way that will make the literature review less painful to write. And I know it may seem like I'm talking a lot about the preparation stage, and that's because I am. Because the writing of the literature review itself is not, it flows. It just really flows once your prep work is done, when you have your solid outline, when your sources are organized in a way that you can very easily go back to. And also when your notes are clear enough that you can just write from your notes or use your notes to know exactly where do I have to go to answer this question. And personally, the annotated bibliography is the most successful way that I have found to do that. Now, an annotated bibliography is a list of sources with the citations already written down. Future you will be thankful for that when it comes to putting together your reference section. And you include some form of annotation in your own words that summarizes the text and how it is useful or supportive of your project. Now, this in your own words is really important because the vast majority of plagiarism is unintentional plagiarism. It comes from being tired, you're reading an article, you're saying, I'm just going to copy this quote in and I will paraphrase it later. And but you know, you never know. Will future you remember to paraphrase it? Will future you remember it was a quote? But it's also that your understanding of what this means and how it fits into your own work will make so much more sense if you take that extra minute to say, okay, how do I explain this? How do I put this down in my own notes? It'll also make more sense to future you. But this most important part is, how is this useful for you? Because you can write down every detail about how a study was done and what their results were, what did they find, what were their methods. But if you don't have that note on why did you write notes on this article? Why use this article? Where is this article going to go? Leave yourself a note to say, this will be supportive of this subtopic, or I want to put this in my conclusion. I want to put this in this part. You know, make a note for yourself of where is this going to fit. And I often find it helpful also to have my outline doc and my annotated bibliography doc open at the same time, because then if, as I'm taking notes about an article in my annotated bibliography, sometimes I'll just pop things over into the outline while it's fresh in my head, because again, you're tired, you're stressed, you're busy. Future you may not remember to do everything that current you is thinking of so brilliantly. So as you're writing the notes for your annotated bibliography, ask yourself these questions. Where does this fit into my research area? What part of my argument is it relevant to? What ideas from it am I building on? And what are the limitations? Because, you know, be critical. Sample sizes, time frames, location, generalizability. Make all those notes. Here's a good template that I have found personally useful. You don't have to have all of these pieces. Some people like to keep it more general because it feels less overwhelming. You might start out with a more specific template that you copy paste down the page and then just fill in for each article, and then have it get more general as you become accustomed to your own style. But here's an example. So it would be full citation, brief summary. I like to do more bullet points because I get overwhelmed by a wall of text. The methodology, so what kind of, you know, for me, it would be what kind of study was it? For someone else, it might be what kind of book was it? What was the purpose of writing this? Your evaluation of the conclusion, and then this usefulness for your own self. Here's another, apologies for the screenshot of it, but here is another little framework that I like to use when I'm reading. Feel free to take a screenshot of this because it's just, this is something that I've copied over, you know, from day one of the PhD program that I just keep coming back to because these questions are so useful. And this comes from Swales and Feek, which is like a classic piece of literature and writing center studies that you'll probably hear us bang on about quite a bit. Let's talk very briefly about mechanics. I'm being mindful of time, but it's important to go over. So we, in a lit review, we talk a lot about this sort of meta discourse. So it's part of your text that's referring to another part of your text. And when we do this, it increases the clarity for the reader. So you're essentially giving signposts. Think of it like stage directions or a screenplay directions for your literature review. This is things like, in this section, I will discuss, or as mentioned in the above section, blah, 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 this happened, and now I'm covering it in a different way. Or thus far, the review has outlined, but now I'm going to switch gears. So it's much like the way that when we're writing a sentence, we have to explain how subjects relate to each other, or how an action is contextualized. Same thing with your literature review. This also reduces the feeling that it's just a list of summaries. So this meta discourse, it serves as like an introductory section on a map of the progression of your narrative. It also is used in the conclusion when you're summarizing. You use these meta discourse terms to refer back to different parts of your literature review in the conclusion, but also throughout the text to link things together and to tie ideas together from different sections. And I'm not going to go over this too much because you guys have done this quite a bit. You're very familiar with the process of comparing articles, but this will be very useful as you're going through your qualifying exam prep of just looking at main arguments. How do different authors and different pieces compare, contrast? How has research been conducted in the past? What is all the literature saying, they've done a certain kind of study, but they should really be doing a different kind of study? Are a lot of these theoretical papers, but they really need to be tested? Think about questions like that. Is there enough data? Is there enough information out there? How adequately does what's out there answer the questions that you're trying to answer? What sorts of theoretical frameworks or approaches have been used? Do they work well? Is one more effective or appropriate? And overall, how convincing is the body of literature that's out there? Are there works that you're comparing that are too different to evaluate? Is it like too much apples and oranges? Are you doing a true extension, or are you providing a bridge? So by asking yourself these kinds of questions and comparing and contrasting the articles that you're pulling for your literature review, it also helps you to put together, what is the narrative? What is the story that I'm telling about what is out there? So in terms of, let me move this. In terms of preparing to write itself, start by organizing your articles. However works for you. There is no right or wrong way as long as it's effective. Remember, there will be some overlap. Some people will write about the same things. Think about how are they writing about it? Is it very similar or very different? These overlaps help you to make sense of what you're reading and to develop your narrative. Use graphs, visual aids, make notes for yourself, make outlines, have an annotated bibliography, whatever helps you to understand and conceptualize the story that you're telling about your paper. And also in terms of citations, I'm not going to go over this too much just because you've done this a lot. And you want to just make sure that when you are using citations in a sentence, I don't really like this example here because so many times I find that people will center the author and not the construct. And if you find yourself saying, Muehlbuck and Walsh examined this, Jay et al. Said this, rather than starting with the concept and then backing it up with a citation. I like to say we often hide behind other people's work. We hide behind other citations, and it's one way where the point that you're trying to put forward becomes obscured. So just make sure that the citations, that the works that you're citing are supporting you rather than the other way around. I won't go over this one too much. And for the verb tense issues, just make sure that it is consistent. Your verb tenses may shift throughout the writing of the literature review as you're talking about things that happened in the past, things that you're planning to do in the future, but make sure to pay attention to potential verb tense errors, because these are some of the things that when your reader starts to notice verb tense errors or citation errors, it decreases perceived credibility, even if you actually know exactly what you're doing. You are very smart, remember that. And then finally, the CWR Canvas modules. There is an entire Canvas page with the information that I'm showing here, with additional resources, with templates for every technique and approach that I talked about. There are there are matrix templates, there are the Excel templates, we have, I believe we even have some annotated bibliography templates. Just, sign up on the Canvas page and explore. And if there's something you can't find, that's what we're here for. And Jessica Delgado, again, provided a couple years back a really, really great list of resources in terms of what is a literature review, how do I do it well, how do I even begin to conceptualize starting a literature review and getting over what can be a really overwhelming process. So I recommend a lot of these. Yes, thank you for the link. Please enroll in the CWR Canvas page. We've done our best to make it logical and pretty. But yeah, I would also like to say, just first of all, thank you for letting me intrude on your time. And it's always really fun to chat with folks about how can we make your literature reviews more effective, but also how can we just make this process in general less overwhelming. Cool. And with that, now that I've talked at you guys for 50 minutes, does anyone have questions? Oh, come on, there has to be something. I've seen at least a couple eyebrow twitches.
Sorry, this is Anne. Hi.
Hi.
Hi, sorry, I'm so late. And thanks, Anne, for doing this. I really appreciate it. Is that presentation available in the Canvas or?
It should be, but if it is not, I will make sure that it is uploaded.
Okay. There were some documents within that Canvas module that were not accessible, I noticed.
Ooh, please, if you find those, can you send us an email just to let us know what was not accessible?
Okay.
And then I will also be here tomorrow. So
Okay.
if you, let me put my email in the chat.
Okay.
And let's make sure that I am chatting everyone and not just Katrina. And what definitely, if there are resources that you would like, if there are things you can't access that you'd like to access, let me know and I'll do my best to get those to you for tomorrow.
Great, thanks.
I'll also add that on Monday, you'll receive an email with the recordings for each of the sessions, along with all the PowerPoints for any of the workshops. So you'll get that along with a link to a survey for the weekend.
Oh, great. Thank you.
And please do complete the survey, guys, because I'm the one who goes through and analyzes the results. And it's really, really helpful to know what do people like, what's useful, what do people never want us to do again, stuff like that. Did anyone have any? So actually, who here is currently writing a literature review? Because I mean, I am. Is anyone in
literature review for the dissertation?
A dissertation or any part of your quals that is made up of a review of the literature?
That's not clear to me. I don't know if anyone else here is in. I think there are a couple here in the cultural studies, but I've been told that we're required to write an annotated bibliography, and I'm kind of confused the difference.
Yeah,
and you probably have covered this.
No worries. I can actually speak to that if that's all right with you all. So let me see if I can share my screen one more time. So a literature review itself is the full paper, right? So it's the full paper where you're laying out a narrative, where you're
paper for the qualifying exam.
It could be a paper for a qualifying exam. It could be chapter 1 of your dissertation, but a literature review in general is where you're laying out the narrative in a full written form, right? Whereas an annotated bibliography is traditionally something that looks like this. It's more in like a note-taking form, where you'll have your citation, you'll have a summary of what was covered in that source. You might talk about the methodology they used. You might evaluate the conclusion of that source, and then you might talk about how it will be useful to your dissertation or whatever your end purpose is.
Okay, so that example that you have up there would be the best template
It's the one I personally have found effective.
for
Anytime,
annotated bib. work.
yeah, for an annotated bib. And so for each source would have a chunk like this.
Okay,
But for something that is instructed by your department, I would say always double check the requirements with them. Always double check to say, okay, when they say annotated bib, what are they talking about? How do they want that formatted? But it's an annotated bibliography is usually like the first step of a literature review.
yeah, I've only been told by professors that I have to write an annotated bibliography related to my lists.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, no, it's a really good way of helping to identify themes in your readings, to start to get a sense of what is or isn't out there in the literature that is existent.
Mhm.
And I use it like as I'm writing. It's if I didn't have my annotated bibliography, I would get nothing done. Great. Any other questions? Hey, silence is golden. That's beautiful. If you think of anything else about the process of writing a literature review, about annotated bibliographies, about how to organize or make sense of these massive lists of sources and notes that we end up with by this point in our grad school journey, please feel free, write those down, bring those to me tomorrow. You'll be stuck with me bright and early at 9 a.m. So prepare your coffee. But thank you so much for letting me take up your time and for your attention. You guys are great.